Well, we welcome you back to this afternoon with Lincoln Steed. Is it Dr. Lincoln Steed?
No, thank you.
No, but it would go with the accent, Dr. Lincoln Steed. Anyway, Brother Steed is the religious liberty, I was going to say it and it didn't pop out of my mouth. Thank you, the editor, that's the word I was looking for, is the editor of Religious Liberty and the associate director of the Religious Liberty Department for the General Conference. And because of the coronavirus here, we have a few people in audience, but a lot of people online already. And so we are looking forward to Brother Steed sharing with us again, and I really appreciate him being here, flying all the way out from my home stomping ground of Hagerstown, Maryland. That's where I was born. Well, I was born in Tacoma Park, but I was raised in Hagerstown, attended Highland View and Mount Etna School, and so that's home for me. So take my regards home to all the people I know back there. And we are just delighted to have you here. Why don't you just come on up and we'll have a word of prayer, and then we'll turn the time over to you. Father in heaven, what a privilege to have Brother Steed here with us, and we're just so thankful for the truth that sets us free and for a church that prizes the gift of liberty, the liberty God gave us himself, the freedom of choice. But Lord, we know that freedom is under attack, and we ask that as we continue to move forward, that our church will continue to be at the forefront of encouraging people to live in the freedom that our God has given to us. We thank you, we praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you. I'll accept that introduction. I've been in some larger New York, mostly black churches, and some of the introductions have made me wince, including one that, with good intention, said that I am presently married to my wife, Rosa Delia, and I thought, what does he know that I don't know, But I represent Liberty Magazine for the Seventhday Adventist Church. For many years, Liberty was, for North America, the only organized department, or what passed for a department, but now we have a department, but I'm associate director of the department. But my main responsibility and my main joy is to represent liberty and our religious liberty message to the membership. And I take afternoon meetings regularly, usually with a few more people, but I'm presuming that out there are others. And I won't belabor things too much this afternoon, and maybe the few that are here can ask some questions, and that'll be it. But I want to throw something out to you in light of the coronavirus scare, which has already seen the near collapse of the economic system. Certainly the stock market in a few days has dropped further than I remember, and I think as low as it had dropped in any given day on the Great Depression. As well as that, we've changed all of our social mores, we've closed schools, we're under effectively a state of emergency. Let me read you a bill and see if you think that such a thing might appear shortly. This is Senate Bill number 2983, a bill to secure to the people the enjoyment of the first day of the week, commonly known as the Lord's Day, as a day of rest, and to promote its observance as a day of religious worship. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? And this is how it was worded in the first paragraph. I won't read the whole bill, but it says, "Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America or in Congress assembled, that no person or corporation or the agent, servant, or employee of any person or corporation shall perform or authorize to be performed any secular work, labor, or business to the disturbance of others, works of necessity, mercy, and humanity accepted, nor shall any person engage in any play, game, or amusement, or recreation to the disturbance of others on the first day of the week, commonly known as the Lord's Day, or during any part thereof in any territory, district, vessel, or place subject to the exclusive jurisdiction of the United States, nor shall it be lawful for any person or corporation to receive pay for labor or service performed or rendered in violation of this section." That's a Sunday law. That's the bill that in 1888 nearly passed That's the bill that in 1888 galvanized the Seventhday Adventist Church Religious Liberty Department and the editor A.T. Jones, believing that this was the final issue in this country before overt persecution and the close of probation. And that's the sort of bill that could pop up any time. There's the statement, I think in the sermon this morning I alluded to how there's the old saying that in the trenches there are no atheists. Once things get tough, people become quite spiritually inclined, but without spiritual understanding, this is the way they address it. And at some point, with the litany of storms and tornadoes and droughts and fires, economic collapse, pandemics that we're experiencing, I think we're going to see, as we've always seen in human history, some bright sparks say, it's time to honor God, let's enact this. And ironically, a lot of what our Religious Liberty Department is doing is to make a cleavage between secular initiatives and the spiritual rejuvenation of the community, because we want that, but we don't want those with political power and obviously by definition their own particular view of what religious observance might be to force that on others. For Seventh-day Adventists, with an understanding of history, a lot of our interpretation of prophecy and interpretation of current events in the US has had a reference toward the actions of the Roman Catholic Church, which of course, by that church's own admittance during the Middle Ages, was not very defensible. Only not too many years ago, the Catholic Church came out with a document called Memory and Reconciliation, where they, quote, apologized for the Inquisition and the persecution of the Jews and various other things. I wish the apology had been more watertight, but it was premised on this sort of logic. This is a quote essentially directly from that document. It said, "Just as Christ, holy and undefiled and incapable of error, took upon himself the sins of fallen human beings, so the church, the magisterium of the church, holy and incapable of error, will apologize for the actions of those in former ages." So they're sorry in recognizing that this was wrong, but they've not given away a certain preeminent view of their power in relative to the government. A few years ago, I attended an all-day seminar at Catholic University in Washington, D.C. that was put on for Catholics, not closed, but it wasn't advertised to anyone else. And I got myself invited, and I wanted to hear Cardinal Dolan talking on religious liberty. He was then a newly minted cardinal from New York, had been one of the, I thought, leading contenders to be Pope, but he ended up not being elected, but certainly a very charismatic and conservative religious figure. And I sat just in front of him at a round table, looking up at him as he spoke, and he spoke well on religious liberty. And halfway into his talk, he stopped, and I was close enough to see that he'd become preoccupied, which sadly happens to me now and then. You can know what you're saying, and you're sort of offloading the buffered words, but you're having a little conversation. And the danger is, as happened to him, your buffer runs out and you haven't thought of what's next. So he sort of stopped, and he looks blankly at people for a while, and then he said this. He said, Roman Catholics would once not have spoken this way about religious liberty. We once held that error has no rights. And then he finished up quickly and hopped down and sat down next to me, all happy, got off his chest. He told Catholics something that they didn't seem to remember. And after there was a break after that, then they reconvened, and there were set topics, 3 of them, as I remember, for the next hour. And before they could begin those topics, and there was a theologian, a historian, and a Catholic Charities individual up front to present, but before they could say anything, there was a clamour from the audience, and they said, "What was the Cardinal talking about? What was he talking about?" So for 1 hour, they had to be tutored in a little church history and the dynamic that we're presently living through. And they had to be told that was indeed the default setting of Roman Catholicism, but it had been put aside because of Vatican II in the 70s. And in that church council called by Pope John, there was a document called Dignitas Human Eye, presented by a Jesuit priest, an American Jesuit priest, Father McMurray. And it was called The Dignity of Man, and it said for the first time in modern Roman Catholic presentations, it said that you have the right as an individual to choose your religion free of coercion, change your religion free of coercion, and practice it as you see fit. That was revolutionary. And I have to say that there is a breath of fresh air in the Roman Catholic Church because of this. Because of it, Roman Catholics can ask questions that the priest would not have answered before. They're reading the Bible. They're not, by and large around the world, acting coercively to other churches. But as Cardinal Dolan admitted, the default setting is still error has no rights. And the last two popes had regretted Vatican II and were working to undo it. And in many ways, what's happening in the Catholic Church now reflects that ambivalence. And the short way I see of judging this is watch public statements on Vatican II. When that weakens, we are back to that basic position, which is not good. And the document that I want to talk a little bit about that has to have that as the backdrop is Laudato Si. At the moment, we're all afraid of catching cold and dying of lung congestion, and it's not an unreal threat, but it will pass. But what is with us for the rest of human history is environmental degradation. The US is lagging a little in some other countries' recognition and readiness to do something, but there's already broad-based response from populations all around the world. Within the last 12 months, Greta Thunberg, a young girl from Scandinavia, has galvanized crowds of tens of thousands in all the continents by youth appeal to save the planet from the older people and the impotent legislators who won't act. And she says, how dare you take away our future? How dare you do this? And the Pope of Rome, I believe, has seen the lay of the land on this and come out with a document called Laudato Si, which says, praise be to thee. And it's a very interesting line of logic. And I've studied the documents coming out of Rome for decades now, and none of them exist in isolation. They build on each other. And the documents that immediately preceded this, in particular, one called Caritas et Veritatis by Benedict, that came out in 2008 during the economic collapse, tried to address all of the world's problems, including environmental degradation. And it said very tellingly, it said there is a need for a body or a power, I'm trying to think of the term it used, but a global entity with the power to act and the power to enforce. And the Bible talks about seeking to change times and laws. So they're recommending enforcement. And in this document, Laudato Si, it gets more specific on the environmental decay. And at the beginning, it says that the earth is like our younger sister, our little sister, and she's dying. And unless we do something, she will die, and we will die with her. That's pretty high stakes. We're all going to die unless we address this problem. And in the beginning of the document, he says it's not to Catholics, not to Christians. This is to the entire world. It's a global document. And here, for human survival, we have to do something. And then the logic starts to present itself. And it's a long document, so I'm hesitating a minute because I'm not about to read 140 some pages. But early on, he says this. Here it is. It says, although the wickedness of man was great in the earth, he's talking about the last destruction of the earth, and the Lord was sorry that he'd made man. It says, nonetheless, through Noah, who remained innocent and just, God decided to open a path of salvation. In this way, he gave humanity the chance of a new beginning. So this is what this document holds out. We can start again. We can fix it. How? It says all it takes is one good person to restore hope. The biblical tradition clearly shows, this is a key statement early on, clearly shows that this renewal entails recovering and respecting the rhythms inscribed in nature by the Creator, hand of the Creator. We see this, for example, in the law of the Sabbath. On the seventh day, God rested from all his work. He commanded Israel to set aside each seventh day as a day of rest. Couldn't be plainer and wonderful. It's absolutely correct, biblically. It's no problem. It goes a little further, if I can find some of them. Again, I suffer from having too many pages on this. But it says, the law of weekly rest forbade work on the seventh day, so that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and the son of your manservant and the stranger may be refreshed. From Exodus 23. Rest opens our eyes to the larger picture and gives us renewed sensitivity to the rights of others. And so the day of rest centered on the Eucharist, he means Sunday, sheds its light on the whole week and motivates us to greater concern for the poor. And elsewhere it says, on Sunday, our participation in the Eucharist has special importance. Sunday, like the Jewish Sabbath, is meant to be a day which heals our relationship with God and with ourselves. And at the end of this document it says, as we journey toward the eternal Sabbath. So based on this, based on statements that are coming out of Rome and the answer from often not very religious organizations, it's obvious that a calling back to a spiritual acknowledgement of God as the Creator, for Adventists, see the first angel's message, that this is going to be the rallying call for a world that must survive. And if you don't go along with this, you're opposed to God and you're opposed to those that would save this world. It's exactly what we'd expected from prophecy, but to see it work out is quite amazing. And I don't believe it's done from malice in the slightest. It's done from a misunderstanding of how religious observance should be required and how the Bible should be interpreted. The Seventh-day Sabbath is Saturday, not Sunday, by the Roman Catholic Church's own admission, maybe it's too weak a word, by their own proclamation in the document Dominus Dei. It came about because the early Christians, without, it says, any direct command from their Lord, felt they had the authority. So it's a question of authority, an assumed authority of a Christian body, that they could shift it. So if you're going biblically, we keep the seventh-day Sabbath, which is Saturday. And if you understand religious liberty, as I believe Cardinal Dolan and his peers at the moment surely do, you cannot force things on people. And I've told Adventist audiences a truism, that if by some mischance of American politics, if a certain Adventist doctor had been elected president, and if he were foolish enough to push on Congress to pass the seventh-day Sabbath law, it would be wrong. We don't believe in forcing religious observance on others by law. It has to be the heart that changes, and it's before God. So I really have a burden that Seventh-day Adventists and those that are listening through or reading through Liberty magazine what we're saying on the separation of church and state and the value of religious liberty in these times need to be clear on this. There is a huge crisis, conflict looming on this, and whether it's the coronavirus or the next fire in California, or we don't know. A succession of calamities always draws a community to its gods. We're in Christendom, so it will be to God. But if it was a Buddhist country, then you would see a rise in the power of Buddhism within the country. So it's to be expected. It's prophesied. It's logical. And we've warned against it for a long time. But of course, we still have freedoms, and that's the wonderful thing. But we need to understand, and I only intend to go for about 5 more minutes, and then we can have 1 or 2 questions perhaps. But think about what's happening in the United States at the moment. Nobody's forcing us to close our doors, although we're told to close our doors because of an emergency, and we need to think carefully on that dynamic. Well, for a short term it might make sense, but we can't let apparent emergencies or exigencies of the moment force us into total compliance or departure from our religious faith. You need to remember that, because governments will always tell you it's an emergency, because it's their imperative that they want to advance. They're not thinking from the point of individual freedom usually, or of conscience. I'm trying to think where to link to the next thing. But, as far as religious liberty in the US, as I say, we're not restricted now. But the dynamic of religious liberty has changed in dangerous ways. The premise of true religious liberty, which I believe is defensible biblically, but in its more recent form comes from the Protestant awakening that originated in Europe and spread to this new continent. The Protestant view of religious liberty is that you are responsible for God, not through a church, but it's a personal conscience issue. And the true principle of religious liberty is the right to believe or disbelieve whatever you want. You're responsible to God. And religious liberty only exists when all beliefs are protected. You can't have a situation where, for example, you say you're restricting Islam, restricting Jehovah's Witnesses, restricting Wiccan believers or whatever, but allowing Baptists, say. That's not religious liberty. At the moment, the surveys put out, in particular by the Pew Forum, say that 70% plus of the world's population live under situations of extreme restriction of religious liberty. But it's a bit misleading, because most of the countries so designated, those people don't feel restricted. They belong to a dominant majority that is not granting rights to the minority, but they are doing exactly as they want. But their system is severely against religious freedom. And the US, in the last couple of years particularly, has slipped dangerously into this dynamic. At the moment, most of what passes for religious freedom, at least on initiatives and legal holdings and so on, from the courts and from government leaders, is rather put as religious entitlement. It's religious favoritism, religious legislation to aid and empower a particular religious viewpoint, a particular religious constituency. We are losing rapidly the sensitivity for broad-based freedom for all people and all conscience-held views. And that has got to be very dangerous. And perhaps there's no greater danger in the US than that for this to follow. It means the Constitution and its underlying intent is just, there's a thumbing of the nose at it. And of course, as always, as I remember once, I won't name the person because it's polarizing anymore to name political figures, but a major political figure spoke at a Liberty dinner and said a truism that civil and religious liberty run hand in hand. You cannot affect religious liberty without affecting civil liberty. And it's no accident that at the moment in the United States, the plainest statements of the Constitution are regularly being set aside. And Seventhday Adventists are told, in the voice of a visionary that was one of our pioneers, she said it in conjunction with the Sunday law finally being passed in this country. She said, the United States will eventually repudiate every principle of the Constitution. It sounds harsh, and it is harsh, but it happens through this process. Ignoring one part of necessity means you're soft on the other, and I think what's enabling most of it, and that's why we keep talking about it and sending Liberty magazine out to the legislators, is there is, as the Bible says, gross ignorance. It says, my people perish for lack of knowledge. And gross darkness, gross ignorance is a dangerous thing for freedom generally and for religious liberty in particular. I know we have a small group here today, but maybe you have big questions. Does anybody want to start a discussion on something that's of interest at the moment?
I notice many Adventist leaders are very reluctant to talk about things like homosexuality, same-sex marriage, things that kind of depreciate a society. And they say that they don't want to, Adventists shouldn't be speaking out on these things because it's part of freedom of conscience to let people do these things. Because if you start to put laws against some of these things, like homosexuality and things like that, you're going to bring on more stringent laws leading to the Sunday law. But then I'm thinking, if you let society go down like this and God calls, say, homosexuality abomination, well, that's going to bring on the judgments. And the judgments, seems to me, are what's going to bring on the Sunday laws. So it seems like we're in a conundrum here. How long do you let society degenerate before, as Christians, you start to speak up against it? I don't mean with laws, I mean with protest.
Well, you sort of answered your question. Christians should always speak moral truth to a society.
But I don't see
unfortunately, too many of the Christian voices that were reported in the last few years as this homosexuality issue has arisen have been very condemnatory, very polarizing, not at all charitable Christian. There was the Westboro Baptist Church that would demonstrate at military funerals, and I think they'd picked on some of them as being gays, and they would chant, "You're going to hell." What a horrible thing to the family, grieving family, to hear this sort of Christian message yelled at them. But as far as speaking to an immoral world, of course we're to speak out. We're under obligation to do that. But a lot of this current debate between, or more than a debate, this war between so-called Christians and the gay community, it's almost a battle to the death, and it's put across often as either Christian rights or gay rights. It shouldn't have to be both. What the Christians should see is that the gay rights, as well as any other number of immoral social models and degradations, these are a sign of a collapsing society that's losing both its Judeo-Christian norms and really its structure that's held it together. We're looking at a collapse of society. There's no other way to see this. And Christians need to speak to this, but in an evangelistic, personal sense. As it says of Jesus, he went about as someone who meant well for people. So it's not to directly condemn them, but we need to speak to that issue. And I'll just give you one example, a practical example, where I think the message should be different. There's a problem over baking cakes and wedding pictures and so on, where a number of Christians have risen up on their haunches and say, "I will not bake you a cake, you heathen, you lepers, moral lepers." And it's gone to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, who clearly are wanting to protect religious values and religious norms, they may have problems, but they're hardly a secular court. And they deferred this last one by saying, holding in favour of the Christian, but not for the reason he thought, because he'd been maligned by certain gay communities. But rather than the bad reaction that so far these couple of test cases have shown on the part of Christians, if you're running a cake shop, or a cake decorating shop, and a gay couple comes, which is abnormal to start with, if you think about it, certain businesses like cake preparation or wedding photography, people go where they're simpatico. You pick that up quickly, so they would not naturally seek out a Bible-believing Christian for this anyhow. So these are provocations. But if they came, all you have to say is, thank you for choosing my business. I appreciate you choosing this business. You may not know that I'm a Seventhday Adventist Christian, Bible-believing Christian, and what I read in the Bible tells me that the lifestyle you represent is not recommended. It's not something that I can support normally. Not normally. I can't support. So you may have come to the wrong business, but if you want to use my business, I will do the best I can. There's nothing compromising on that, nothing polarizing, nothing legally problematic. I mean, remember, Jesus was accused of being the friend of publicans and sinners because he reached out to them. The worst thing you can do is say, I will not touch you, I will not deal with you, you're a leper. This country has been that route already. I'm not that old, but when I first came to the US in the mid-60s, there were still cases. I saw them down south, signs, they will not serve blacks or Jews. And they had a theology of that. It's a tricky thing, but remember, the early Christian church in the Greco-Roman culture, there were all sorts of abominations, including homosexuality. I've not found any record that they refused to deal with the citizenry. I mean, and Christians were shopkeepers and many other things. The only thing that's very clear from the early days, any soldier that joined the Christian community had to leave the army. Which is something that we're blind on. Many Christians, even some in Adventism, certainly in other religions, are very militaristic, and I think that's a betrayal of the Lord. We're to be the church militant about going to the next world and to the coming kingdom of the Lord, not about militant about, as the hymn says, not by swords, the swords loud, swords loud clashing. It's not through military endeavour. At the moment, the Seventhday Adventist Church has been a co-sponsor just recently of a piece of legislation that I don't particularly support, but it was well-intentioned. It's called, now I've forgotten the title of it, I think choice. But anyhow, what we've tried to do in this legislative proposal that will go nowhere, the Mormons are another group backing it, it speaks well of the granted rights of the gay community. We say that we respect that and all the rest. And then on the other side, it says, since we've stated our respect for their rights, we want to protect the right to receive state monies and discriminate in our operations. And so very conciliatory language to the gays will offend the most conservative Adventist Christians. And the open statement that we want to protect what amounts to state aids in our schools will offend the gays, who I think correctly are not happy, as probably no one in general would be, to see government money supporting a religion different, or a religious view and a religion different from their own. And this is the real crisis facing Adventism now. It's not gays, it is state money. And that is why our church, as many other Christian churches, feel threatened, because what's at stake is not your ability to speak about the morality of this. It's your ability to gain government money and still hold such a position. And the Religious Liberty Department from A.T. Jones's time on has always cautioned about taking state money. It's not immoral to take it, but it's compromising. And our medical institutions, again, take so much money, our schools often. And how could we demand, as we seem to have done in this legislation, that we want to continue to discriminate, even as we take state-levied monies from everyone, people that don't believe in what we're doing? It's an inconsistency.
Well, yeah, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't see the Adventists speaking out against a lot of these immoral things. I'm not talking about legislation, just speaking out and being, and taking a stand against things. Am I wrong?
Yes, but it's probably no more true of Adventists than any other Christian group. At the moment, the Christianity is very selective in what it criticizes, because It's like Lot in Sodom. He was part of it and comfortable with it, but not necessarily participating in those sins. Yes, I think there's a need in the right way to point out the moral collapse of our society and its inconsistency in practice with the Bible, and call people to a higher model and a coming kingdom. But we've got to avoid spitting in the sinner's face. It's just not going to win any converts.
I agree, but
and part of the reason that we're quiet is because we're morally compromised. And it's not. And think further. This is only one sin among many. Like that same Christian shopkeeper who got high and mighty with the gays. If he thinks about it, which he must not have much, on any given day, he's bound to have wife beaters and embezzlers and child molesters coming through his doors. And might not know in every case, but if he's of an inquisitorial nature, he could hear on the grapevine or make judgments based on the look of them. That ends nowhere good, but he has to realize that this is one sin among many. It's not the only sin. I mean, it's one of the more tacky. It makes most people not inclined that way feel squeamish, but as far as losing salvation, it might not even be the one that leads most rapidly to damnation. Selfishness and pride are probably just as bad. And, we don't talk about such things. And as far as I've lived long enough to see the church radically shift its views to adultery and remarriage and that whole thing. That's where I think we've really got to look at it. Rather than upping our game against gays only, we shouldn't become indifferent to this great immorality that's white-handing Western society, but it's not the only sign of moral collapse. But as far as religious liberty, it's the one in the headlines at the moment, I believe, but I think it's largely a red herring. It's not that it's immaterial, but the real issues, big things, as I quoted from the Initiative on the Environment, that's where the huge apostasy is coming, on using force to compel to a wrong Sabbath, to deny the very creatorship of God. And many sins, we need to condemn them in principle, but we can't chase people down into their conscience and, condemn them. Otherwise, we don't know the heart. All I know is, as Paul says when he's speaking to people of his age, he lists all of these things, the adulterers and the perverters and the effeminate, I think is the word he used. And he says, some of these once you were. Clearly, they came out of that. They were a whole gamut of perversions, became Christian and they turned it aside. And we need to point out plainly, which is the real debate. It's not a religious liberty one. Within our church, there is not this understanding anymore that we are to be. And I had a quote that I nearly shared this morning from Spurgeon. He says, a Christian is different. This big tent idea that you come and you live as you are and you call yourself a Christian, it's a contradiction, let alone an Adventist. You can't have any organisation that stands for certain things and if people don't adhere to them. Which reminds me of a case a few years ago. One of the, I think it was at a law college. They had a Christian legal society organisation, and some, I think they were gays actually, that objected to it, and took it to the High Court, and then the determination was that they could join too. Well, you know what? How nonsensical to have a Christian legal society and it's open to non-Christians. That's not a matter of being exclusive or not wanting other people. It's by definition for Christians. And the Seventhday Adventist Church is for Seventhday Adventists, those that at the time of their baptism swear their agreement to these certain viewpoints. I mean, that's what we should be focusing in on. But I'm sorry for such a long answer. Well, that's all my opinion. And how the church exercises it remains to be seen. But we're living in a very dangerous time. There's no two ways about it. A moral decline on every front.
Yeah. One last point. It seems to me that if you love these people, you want to convict them, because they're not going to be converted unless they're
Right.
convicted. But how do you convict them when you go along with their lifestyle?
Right. Well, again, you've answered it. And so the answer lies in a was it Ellen White's quote, a loving and lovable Christian who acts on their belief, but their interchange is on that level. Nobody, whether they're homosexual or a Republican, and if you're a Democrat or the other way, nobody's going to change if you come at them teeth bared and calling them traitorous or not American or whatever.
I just wanted to say that some of my closest friends are actually gay, and they're not my friends because they're gay, but, because we have a friendship.
Right.
But the point is, yes, I agree with the idea that we would like to see conviction in them. So the question needs to be asked, what would promote that conviction? And I think the way we approach their lifestyle is a major benefit or detriment to getting them to think differently. And the thing is that a man convinced against his will is is still.
You got the message on religious liberty. Coercion cannot be part of it.
So the thing is, how would we reach anyone? We're told plainly in the Scripture and Spirit of Prophecy that love is how God reaches
That's why I
us,
said a loving and
that's
lovable
how we
Christian.
would have to reach others. So when it comes to a situation like this, you can still be friends with these people and not agree with their lifestyle.
Right. And even as far as worship in the church, we should welcome these people into worshiping with us. That's not the same as joining them up as card-carrying Seventhday Adventists. But the church doors should be open to everybody. If they want to come, it says, whosoever will, let him come. We have to have an open attitude. That's not what the big tent type people are talking about. They're talking about not having a criteria of determining who's an Adventist or not. And that's the death of any organisation, and will be for Adventists and for Christianity in general, if morality and biblical truth. A few years ago, it's for distribution, but I guess it was said publicly. A few years ago, we had a public debate in Canada. It's quite a few years ago, about 10 to 12 years ago. We had a 5-hour public debate on this in Canada, I remember, put on by the union. And there were a number of us there, including one of the general counsels at the GC. There was an Adventist lawyer. There was the religious liberty guy for the Canadian Union. There was an associate from the General Conference. There was the White Estate. I think that's about it. And the one person, maybe I would not identify the person, but I knew their views. They got up and they said correctly that the Adventist Church had been slow to get understanding on the matter of women's rights. I worked for a while at Pacific Press, and they had the case of Mary Kay, a woman that sued the press to get equal pay. It was most embarrassing. And he said we'd been slow on civil rights. And I remember my father back in the 60s telling me stories at that time of pastors down south standing out front of the church with a baseball bat to keep certain people out. And we understand it now, we got it. And he said, the day is coming. This is word for word as I remember it. This guy said, the day is coming when we're going to accept gays and their lovers into church membership and church office, and the sooner we do this, the better. Now, he used syllogistic reasoning, but that just is an anathema view. And I got up and I said, for his view to follow, it means you cannot believe or follow one single direct statement from the Bible. That just white ants everything. So he logically led us from two unfortunate attitudes of the church to past issues and saying that we need to get ahead of the curve and just go with it. That's wrong. The correct answer is, you were saying, we have to have a Christian attitude toward this, not monolithic, but this growing influence of this community, and we need to approach them with charity and humanity but hold a hard line on what it means to be a Seventh-day, Bible-believing Seventh-day Adventist. And I hope the church does that. Time will tell. I mean, we haven't yet formally gone back on it, but the pressures are building, I must admit. And I guess it's mostly Adventists watching online. But I can tell you from what I've had discussions that the women's ordination thing, which is reasonable on the face of it, I've become convinced that it's not purely a doctrinal thing. But the women's ordination dispute has as its hidden agenda by a number of people, or its second phase is the full incorporation of gays into the Adventist community. Anyhow, you got me down a route that is problematic and not purely religious liberty. And it's worth remembering, I've even had whole television programs on 3ABN on this, because so many people begged it. We've discussed internal church disputes. Now, these are real, and horrible injustices can be visited on individuals, but narrowly speaking, by the criteria of religious liberty, they are not issues of religious liberty. And as the lawyers point out, and it's a good thing to keep in mind, a church is a free association. You cannot be forced against your will in a church association. So it's not religious liberty, narrowly speaking, but it may be a matter of justice, a matter of truth, a matter of doctrinal integrity, and so on. And it needs to be addressed. But it's not easily or even properly addressed by the Religious Liberty Department. Anyone else? Or else I'll have to give a closing soliloquy.
So, as a pastor, I've had to help a number of church members with Saturday Sabbath, getting it off. As I understood it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the law says you have to make reasonable accommodation if you have 50 employees or more. Is that the law?
Yes.
So reasonable accommodation can be very widely interpreted. But I have worked in several situations where the people were not kindly treated. And I very quickly intervened, and I said, I understand, in writing, I said, I understand that if you can't accommodate this person, that you must let them go. We understand, we accept that. But don't you dare mistreat my people.
Right.
And when I did that, and it got into their lawyers' hands, and they said, have you been mistreating these? You leave them alone. And so they all got to either keep their jobs or even got promoted.
Well, that's very interesting. You've sort of turned it to another issue beyond religious accommodation. There's not to be a license for an employer to mistreat an employee. Religious accommodation is an interesting and important aspect of what the department does. It's not the only thing. Many people think it's the be-all and the end-all of religious liberty. It's most important, especially if you've got Sabbath accommodation problems, but it's not all that we do. But I think a lot of people misunderstand the nature of, or the constitutional nature of religious liberty in the US. The Constitution, which is hardly read by most people, says almost nothing about religion. It's half of one amendment. And remember, by definition, the amendments, they are now part of the Constitution, but they were not part of even the original Constitution. The amendments were added at the insistence of the 13 colonies, or 13 sovereign states that covenanted together to form the original Union. And they enumerated particular rights and freedoms that were presumed by the original Constitution. In the original Constitution itself, the only religious clause is it says no religious test for public office. People forget that when they're vote. Well, I mean, they can vote as they want, but at the time that candidates has come forward, there's been some very prejudicial things said against people of different faith, and it should be irrelevant, at least for the right for someone to run for public office. The only other thing in the Constitution is in the First Amendment, and it's only half of the First Amendment. The second half of the First Amendment is on freedom of the press, freedom of speech. But the first half says Congress, which was, of course, means the federal government. But since the Civil War, the states' rights in many regards don't have the same weight, so the federal law is dominant now. So it says, Congress shall make no law establishing religion. And all sorts of articles, even in Liberty, are on that. What does establishing mean? But, there's the established church in England, the Church of England, supported financially and politically by the government. They clearly meant that. It's pretty easy to enlarge it and to say that the government is not in the business of funding, legally supporting or orchestrating religious activity or the religious organizations. So it says, Congress shall make no law establishing religion nor prevent the free exercise thereof. And thereof means religion. So the government is not to have any hand in organising religion or organising religious activity and faith practice. Just hands off, right? Which would, by definition, mean that you should be free from government coercion in the workplace. But you don't work for the government, right? You work for private entities. So the real threat, or not threat, the real strength to getting accommodation in the workplace comes from a much more recent legislation in the 60s. The civil rights legislation is Title 7, or Section 7 of it, where it says that you're not to be discriminated against on the basis of race, gender, disability, or religion. Seems like I'm missing something else out. But certainly religion was put in there. And that's been very effective for a long time. It's very plain, it's unambiguous. You can't be discriminated against on that basis. But as you said a little earlier, it's gotten a little bit more sharp recently because of what is undue hardship. Obviously, where it says you can't be discriminated, that's not an open thing. Like if I belong to a church that believes something on a basic law, well, the worst case, if I believe that I can sacrifice children, that's not going to go. There's other laws that override that drastically. And if you let's get more relevant. If you belong to a church that believes that every day is sacred, they're not going to give you every day off and pay you a salary. I mean, that's the ridiculous assumption. So there are some limits, or there's a balance, of your need and the trouble to them. But it's gotten so ridiculous of late that they've expressed it in a legal term as de minimis. If there's a de minimis cost of accommodation, and it's been stated it could be as little as $1 worth of value. What that means is, in practice, if you ask for accommodation and they give you this weekend off, they're probably legally off the hook beyond that if it goes to a legal challenge. In practice, though, 99% of the cases where the pastor gets involved, where the person has a problem and they contact the church quickly or a legal agency, it's usually as simple as just talking to the employer, explaining that you have rights under the civil rights legislation, a letter showing that there are others watching beyond this person. It just evaporates. Most people want to do the right thing, even if they're also wanting to maximize their profit and minimize their trouble. So most times people will be accommodated, but every time it goes the full legal challenge, it's dicey, and we rarely win. And so to deal with that, in the last decade and a half, the church has been trying to get through, with others co-sponsoring, the Workplace Religious Freedom Act, which would not change the law, but change the dynamic of the law. At the moment, the poor employer, after they're initially rebuffed, then has to show why they should get the accommodation. With this law, if it were ever passed, it would be you are accommodated unless the employer can show why it's impossible. So it just changes the burden of proof. And so far, we've not done well. We got very close. I even sat in myself on one of the Senate hearings on this when we thought we had it. We had a bipartisan coalition. It should have gone through. But during the hearing, the gay lobby objected, which was predictable, but the employers' lobby, representing the employers, really came out strong against it. And it's never regained an initiative. So that's something that we can pray for relief on. But that's only a part of religious liberty. I've always believed, and I'm not a lawyer, but I deal with lawyers a lot, I've always believed that the real issue is not legal, it's societal. Because what is the legal system anyhow but a putting down on paper and formalising what the community feels? And in fact, an awful lot of what we have, even to this day in the United States, is a carry-on from legal and social norms and expectations that go right back to Europe and to England and to the Protestant Reformation. And I think the greatest danger to civil and religious liberty is this corporate, societal drifting away from even viscerally understanding these things. And the surveys in the US are very troubling. I think with the Trump administration, some of them might not apply anymore because every day the president tweets, so he's pretty well known. But previously, in any precedent in my lifetime, when they did surveys, it was a minuscule number, somewhere around the order of 5 or 6% only, that could name the current president. And gets worse when they go to some of the major figures. Gets much worse when people are asked to spit back portions of the Constitution. Most people, when they think of the Constitution, I've discovered, are really thinking of the Declaration of Independence, which is a state document, but it is not a legal document in the sense of setting out our governance. It's just a reason why the US separated from England. So what we're faced with is gross ignorance and forgetfulness and social shift. And so we're sitting ducks, I believe, for imposed changes or changes that come about through emergencies like the one we're currently under. People will easily give away for security what they don't even know they have. And since 9/11, we've seen incredible changes in privacy laws and the rights of the individual versus the state, things that in practice fly against the intent of the Constitution. But you should read the Constitution. Obviously, on the Lord's Day, on Sabbath, read the Bible first. But when you're talking about religious liberty, the second document, I think all people need to read the Constitution for themselves. And you might find some things, like just the other day, I found something that, when I look back on it, how come no one said anything at the time? In enumerating the rights and the powers of the presidency, the Constitution says that he has the right to issue pardons, but it says these pardons do not extend to issues of impeachment. It doesn't say of his own impeachment, just impeachment. Remember, impeachment applies to a number of public officials. And I think back, President Nixon escaped personal impeachment, and then he had his vice president pardon him. It was clearly unconstitutional. And in the 2000 election, things went totally south, and it was a hung election, and they took it to the Supreme Court. Read the Constitution. That's not how it's to be settled. And at the moment, people are clamoring to do away with the Electoral College. If you read the Constitution says nothing about people voting for the president. It says nothing. What it enumerates is the Electoral College, and that they can choose whoever they want. Whoever they want, which is one reason why most people don't know that in most states they have state laws prohibiting the electors to travel out of state during the election. They don't want them leaving the state and gathering together as the Constitution understands and choosing whoever seems right, regardless of who had put their name up. And there's no great moral right or wrong there, but it just illustrates an incredible forgetfulness about the rules that govern this society. And again, to quote the speaker at our dinner, civil and religious liberty goes closely together. So it's very important whether we keep to the Constitution. Well, thank you. Oh, another question?
You were talking about the Constitution a little while ago, and saying that we know in prophecy says that every point of constitution will be repudiated. What would you say now are the ones that are under attack the most presently?
Well, I could go through some of them, but I'll just tell you one that's quite startling. Read the Constitution, and it lays out the power of the president. And it says Congress is to deal with international trade. We've had a president who, by his own say-so, has put tariffs on other countries. That's supposed to be Congress, right? The constitutional outline of the president was someone who led the armies in time of war, but every day they call him Commander-in-Chief. He's not Commander-in-Chief except in time of war, which is to be declared by Congress, not by his provocations or even reasonable responses to provocations from others. But the most egregious thing that I think is leading us down a garden path to some other problematic countries' models is what's, you don't read about it much, but it's well enumerated if you go hunt it. It's known as the unitary principle of executive power. It's been developed over the last couple of decades by usually right-wing faction, but presidents of both parties have been happy to benefit from it. And the shorthand way to understand the unitary principle of executive power is he is above the law. And the Constitution does not grant such a thing. Remember this current president, when he was a candidate, said that he could shoot someone in the main street and get away with it. People took that as hyperbole. But just a few weeks ago, his lawyers, before a high court judge in New York State, arguing a case, and she got a bit miffed with them, and she said, "You mean this? What he said about shooting people in the main street? That's your view? That he's not accountable under the law?" And they said, "That's right, Your Honour. That is the view that is held." And the idea that should come into a Western democracy is just almost unbelievable, but we're living through it. It's not the part of Religious Liberty Department or the Adventist Church to twist the arm of government to obey its own rules. We live under Caesar or whoever it is. But I think it's reasonable to point out these as evidences of a drift away from law and order and from the very Constitution that protects our religious liberty. And on many fronts, the Constitution is really just dismissed. And by the same token, when I first started on this job, I used to tell people, because I deal with a lot of lawyers, and the idea always on accommodation and religious liberty is if we study the Constitution well enough, it'll reveal the absolute truth that will protect us. And I said, it's not impossible that the underlying assumptions of the Constitution really understood may not support what you believe. For example, we know very well, because it's been abrogated by amendments, the original Constitution didn't grant freedom to a slave population. In fact, it quantified their percentage right in voting, or not in voting, they didn't vote at all, in representation. Women did not have the vote. There were things that were not good on the Constitution, and we came within a hair's breadth in formulating this new country of denying the vote to any but landowners. The statement that people glibly quote sounds good, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's not the original statement. John Locke's statement that they took it from was life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. And if you look at the Constitution, it's a property document. Not evil, but it's a different basis than people imagine. And so it's worth remembering that as Christians, we're to be good citizens, we're to obey the laws of the country, we're to respect the Constitution, but equally as Christians, don't confuse it with Holy Writ. It's not an infallible document. It's a landmark document that embodies religious sensibilities after Protestantism and the Enlightenment and a progressive viewpoint that saw the rights of individuals. It's a model for many countries. Even Australia copied elements of the Constitution. So in that regard, wonderful. But don't think it's perfection personified, not at all. It's a good effort from mankind. But God's plan supersedes all that, and God's kingdom, soon to come, is the only eternal kingdom. Well, thank you for your time and attention, and I'm sorry this is a time of panic and fear, not all unfounded, so that's our excuse. But please pray for what we're doing on religious liberty, and remember that this too will pass, and we're not at the end of time yet, and there may be other pandemics, there will be other emergencies, there surely will be other signs of decline of rule of law and order and respect for individual rights. And so in protecting religious liberty, we need to realize this and be unfailing and unflagging in raising an alarm. As Ellen White, writing about the precursor to Liberty magazine, she says, what is it to be but the watchman on the walls of Zion? We're to raise an alarm at this assault upon our liberties. And she also said, and I'll conclude with this, but it's worth mentioning, that to Adventists in her day, as there are in ours, that say, well, this is going to come, why bother? Let it come and then we'll be in heaven. And she says, Satan is ordering things so that we will have neither justice nor mercy, and we should do all that we have in our power to avert the threatened danger. And then the time that we gain, use it to evangelize the Lord. That's the purpose for delay. It says God is not willing that any should perish. He's merciful. And we should be the bringers of God's mercy. And I think in a way that answers again your question on how we deal with gays. We're to bring the mercy of God to these people who are, like many others, often in many ways putting themselves a little outside God's provision for their salvation. Thank you, and God bless you. Let's just bow our heads in a word of benediction. Lord, we thank you for freedom. We thank you that we live in a country that's as dedicated to granting that freedom as any. But we thank you too that we serve a God, the originator of all freedom, and that the ultimate freedom is in knowing you, and the ultimate condition of freedom is living with you in an eternal kingdom. Please bless and guide us toward that end. For Jesus' sake, amen.